So let's pick up on part 2 here, reminding us what we've started with here, that the stories, and I mean stories, right? We're going to see these as adaptive cycles or adaptive histories. And that's what you're looking at with Flash Boys. It's a data set for us to go through about how these adaptive cycles play out, how stories of the adaptive universe and how they begin with, right, in our case, advantages, new capabilities which allow them to change in the face of limited resources. Right? So their response to limited resources to pursue advantage in the rise of high-frequency trading leads to what? New pressures, new kinds of change, new kinds of interactions, new kinds of failure modes, new kinds of opportunities, right? And you start to see this pile one upon another, and you see a rapid increase. We'll call that a fluorescence, right? Not fluorescence in the sense of glowing in the dark, fluorescence as in flowering. Two different spellings. All right, and we'll talk more about that. All right, so when an organization, an entity, a network, or a piece of the network we want to pull out and say is our focus, and of course when we go through high-frequency trading, you're going to keep changing what is in the scope of you looking at those adaptive cycles. Right? Is it IEX? Is it the regulators? Is it Goldman Sachs? Is it whoever? Right? You're going to be playing with who do I want to pull in for the different periods of change. So what we end up with in the first question in the understanding the adaptive universe is how to tell the difference between positive and negative stories. So positive stories are stories, they're not that we will step back and say all the stakeholders got benefits. They're positive stories in the sense that that different adaptive units are responding to changes, seeking opportunities, which leads to additional change so that they can pursue their goals. Other people's goals, other roles' goals, is right, not necessarily always connected in a positive way. Negative stories are where we get into brittleness and some of the different failures. What we see are shortfalls in adaptive capacity, and we see people step into the breach because some people are the generic source of adaptive capacity when we're running out. And we're going to see more about this. This is a setup, and we'll come back to this as we get to the dragons of surprise. Everybody likes the dragons, and we're going to get to the dragons, okay? Change. So we see these go on, and we see an interplay between these. And we'll see that more as we use Flash Boys to highlight these things. So we've seen this already in the NASA cases and the NASA accidents. Change is going on. They live in an environment of change. It's not stable, but things are moving around. That forces them to adapt in various ways, and they adapt too late, or they adapt to the pressures to be, right? So inadvertently, they end up eating sources of resilience, getting more brittle than they realize. How do they realize they're too brittle? When they lost the space exploration or when they lost the space shuttle. That's too late. That's reactive. You want to anticipate and understand and respond before you have a collapse in performance. So what kind of organizations can recognize and adapt before they have a collapse in performance versus which ones, all right, merrily run along going, hey, I'm doing better, I'm doing better. Oops, I just fell off the cliff, right? And that's brittleness. So a key thing in your glossary, and there's a definition in there, to start off with, of the descriptive view of brittleness. And we're going to come back to that and emphasize that in a little bit when we get to the dragons of surprise, because the graphics will be nice and help highlight it for you. But brittleness is very simple. It doesn't say anything about how well you perform when you're away from the boundary. It says when you get close to the boundary, the limits on whatever capability you have, does performance fall off slowly or does performance collapse rapidly? So if I have a piece of material and I put it under stress and external load, all right, something that is brittle will handle the load, boom, and collapse, right, break. So that would be a brittle thing. So you can use that physical analogy versus something that, as you increase load, it starts to stretch, it starts to stretch, it starts to stretch. It may change and transform. In fact, it will change and transform in order to continue stretching under continued load, right? But it has the ability to continue to stretch. And that metaphor of continuing to stretch when you're near the boundary is what graceful extensibility is all about. And we'll get into more about understanding that key concept. Next one. Next one. Faster, better, cheaper pressure. Remember, hit it again. Yeah, right? It's about pressures. Trade-offs. Now, we're not going to do trade-offs today, but I want to emphasize to you, we're going to come through and talk about different kinds of trade-offs. And we're going to talk about trade-offs. This is in Doyle. He calls it robust yet fragile. All right, so he's saying well-modeled, pursuing optimality, even adding in robustness criteria. In other words, well-understood problems that you want to avoid. Right? That trades off with graceful extensibility. Right? Can you extend at the boundaries versus are you brittle? So this issue is as you get more optimal, if you don't do anything else, you will also get more brittle. So this is a trade-off. The pursuit of optimality increases fragility, robust yet fragile. So he's saying, I've got an optimal system. I add in criteria to make it more robust. In a complex world, the irony is there's a trade-off. Now, we're going to talk more about how you draw trade-offs, how they work. That will be a whole section we'll get to in the course. Next one. Let's remind you, you read the paper highlighting four uses that are claimed to be technical uses of the word resilience. Right? So if people are focused on societal need, they tend to emphasize rebound from a traumatic event. Right? How do I bounce back? How does a system, how does a community, how does an individual bounce back from a single trauma or repeated traumas or stressful events? So you tend to go, I need to have rebound. And you'll see a bunch of people trying to measure resilience in terms of how fast we rebound or how deep the well of lost functionality is until we recover. Sometimes if you're focused on the societal need, you'll talk about robustness. Engineers will talk about hardening infrastructures so that they survive or can be designed to be re-engaged following a major external event, a weather event. So there's a bunch of equipment that goes into buildings, for example, that never was designed to be recover after going down, because they didn't think of it going down except in minor ways, local power outages briefly, things like that. Recovering from a major weather event and disruptions, they never thought about how would you get access to these things, how would you do it? It turns out there's lots of interesting engineering twists that can make those things work better when you expand the range of conditions you're designing for. So they can get more robust. The trick on robust is we have to understand the disruptions. They are well modeled or well understood. We are going to talk about the other two. Right? Dealing with these are still linear simplifications. They're not bad from a societal point of view to want to rebound better or to measure how fast you can rebound. Right? It's certainly perfectly reasonable from an engineering point of view to add robustness to systems as long as we understand the disruptions designed for. The issue is that doesn't deal with the constraints of the adaptive universe. Right? And we're going to see graceful extensibility as the opposite of brittleness. The capability to stretch or extend performance when you're near or beyond the boundaries of your normal way of working. However, that has been elaborated to handle different conditions and disruptions. So we often talk about this as how to be prepared to be surprised. How to be prepared to be surprised. Sustained adaptability is about governance. Ostrom is talking about governance. Polycentric governance is what comes from her Nobel Prize winning work. How do you manage this multi-role, multi-echelon system? What are the rules that allow balance among the different roles and levels? Right? As conditions change, Alderson and Doyle talk about it as layered architectures. Right? What are the architectures for layered networks? And we're trying to figure out what those principles are. And that's about how to find limits, the hard limits in the trade space. So we normally are operating on a trade-off curve far from the hard limits. Right? We oscillate on that trade-off curve. We really want to have an architecture that's going to tend to move to, or either adopt a better trade-off curve and tend to move towards the hard limit. Many of our biological examples are operating close to the hard limit on a multidimensional set of trade-offs. The brain being a good example. Right? So a lot of the stuff we do in terms of understanding the fundamentals comes from contrasting successful and unsuccessful cases at managing complexity. And so we'll talk about the Balinese water temples and that change in agriculture, introducing Western rather than traditional techniques, and the unanticipated consequences. In some ways, it's a success story because it tells you the old traditional techniques were in fact well adapted to certain aspects and risks of agriculture in that environment. right? Especially given the water source, given the way it moved to the ocean, given the different communities along the course of the water assets, how that played into what they grew, rice, right? How this all worked, and how the water temples actually acted as a regulatory mechanism to balance the different interests of the different groups and the resource relative to productivity. And we'll see it in related to Western intervention, which says let's scale the whole thing up, we can make it more productive, but it ended up actually creating more production the first year and collapsed the second year. And you'll have to read the story when you see the video from Steve Lansing a little later in the course, okay? So a teaser for that. So the NASA case, right, is, right, we kept pushing under faster, better, cheaper until we had a collapse. We didn't recognize the risk of collapse until we had the collapse. That's too late, right? So this is what we're doing in working through this. So what we're setting you up to go do with the high frequency trading, the first step in charting adaptive cycles using flash buoys as a data set, is to look at the rise of high frequency trading. And so what this is an adaptive cycle or adaptive history. So it's cycle of how change, right, triggers a set of reverberations across the network and scales, how it changes scales. We can think of these often as co-adaptive. Right? I'm adapting to something, you're adapting to how I adapted, you're adapting to the combination of how we adapted, right? And this piles on one upon another until we reach we stall out or it peters out and we end up in kind of a new state. I don't want to use the word equilibrium. We'll trash the word equilibrium later. Because remember, change is dominant, right? So we're not trying to reach equilibrium. Right? Equilibrium is a pause in normal processes of change. Right? That's the flip we're talking about here. Oh, I think that was just related to the thing you just did. Right? The thing you just did, we were trying to design to get to equilibrium and then we're done. Right? And we see this a lot in resilience. If we could just get back to equilibrium, if we could just recover to the previous state. You're like, no, 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 no. The process of adapting changes both the environment and the organization or units adapting. The process of adapting changes both sides. Right? They're not the same through this. So history is progressive. History changes. Anybody from complexity remember what that's called? Path dependence, right? Path dependence matters in complex systems. So where you start, right, where you've been constrains where you can go. Right, so your history matters. And if anyone remember the Zen statement? Remember the Zen statement? History matters, history is not destiny. History matters, history is not destiny. That's a nice slogan for getting into this stuff. The skill I want you to develop most in this class is the ability to chart adaptive cycles. Because if you can chart adaptive cycles, where we've been, how we got to where we are, you can understand how the present is way more precarious than anyone realizes. Right? And if you can understand how it's precarious, you can start to design a resilient future. And we'll fill in more about these headings underneath. All right, so why are we doing flash buoys? We could be doing NASA accidents. Right? Well, we're not going to do NASA. We're going to do a little bit of accidents and stuff, but our main one is going to be the rise of these new computerized financial services because they represent fluorescence. And a fluorescence is, right, something new happens. You adapt. You say, this is value to me. This gives me an advantage. Let me invest. Let me do something different. And you do something different. And because he's doing something different, oh, wait a minute. I can do something different too. And then you go, I can do something different to take advantage of the things they're doing. And you go, wait a minute, they took care of that. They're out competing me. I better change what I'm doing. Right? And then somebody else comes along and says, wait a minute, you're all cheating. You're all skimming money off the transactions. That's not fair. Right? That's what you've been reading about. Right? So we're doing this because it's an example, one of these positive things. Positive not because it is the fair thing or the equitable thing or the ideal thing for all parties concerned. It's because each party is seeing some opportunity and trying to take advantage of that opportunity, which squeezes or affects or changes things for other units in the network who then continue to adapt. And you see this as a rapid change. The rise of high-frequency trading is a rapid change. Right? I can remember the rise of Google. In fact, the student who designed CritFizz walked in one day to the lab and said to me, "Oh, stop using Yahoo. There's this new thing a couple guys at Stanford cobbled together. It's way better, you should use it." 3 months later, everybody in the world was using it. That's how fast it took over because it was a better search engine. What was Yahoo doing? They weren't investing in the search engine capabilities. They thought that was stable and their lead protected. They were trying to figure out how to make money off their search engine. They were trying to monetize it. Google ran them into the ground because their search engine got you much more relevant results quicker. So everybody took advantage. That was an advantage to us as people trying to do something, doing diverse things and finding relevant information. Then Google was stuck. How do we make money off this? Right? They stalled. They fluoresced and they stalled. Right? What took off again was they came up with a new way to monetize. Micro-advertising didn't exist. They bought a small company whose technology turned out not to be that valuable or last, but whose strategy for monetizing search turned out to be everything. Right? All of a sudden, micro-targeting starts. What were businesses thinking about Google search? Oh, that's just a toy. Oh, researchers or consumers can play with that. That's not for business. Right? In a relatively short time, about a year, all of a sudden businesses are like, "Oh my God, look what we can do with this." And plus we have to keep up with the other guy who started doing things with this. Right? And all of a sudden you have a revolution where, is Google a search company anymore? No, it's not a search company. What is it? It's an advertising company, right? Whose mechanism for advertising is search. So it transformed the search world, developed a monetizing mechanism, and morphed into an advertising company. And the part of Google you will never find a thing about is the advertising part, because that's where they get all the money. Right? And they have so much money they can play around with doing dumb things with self-driving cars. But that is the class I'll teach in January, just in case anybody's still around. We can do that in January. So what we're interested in, how things get triggered, different units try to take advantage of it. Sometimes they'll get squeezed and adapt to have to work around the squeeze and problems and bottlenecks they experience. That's what we study the most in cognitive systems engineering. What drives us in that is you make a change and it turns out it squeezes cognitive work and people have to adapt to get the work done. Right? So it gives us a good input into resilience engineering. But we want to start studying more how this fluorescence process happens, how it stalls out, how things reconfigure into new systems. Right? So we're seeing reverberations of changes across a tangled layered network of interdependent units. Changes in one area recruit or open up beneficial changes in other aspects of the network, which opens up new opportunities across other parts of the network. So fluorescence and stall, adaptive cycles. That's what we're going to play with. We can see these in lots of places. We can see workarounds. This is a oil platform accident. Cost a huge amount of money and killed, I forget the exact number of people. Not Deepwater Horizon. This was off Brazil. And they had just a few months before put out a report about how great this facility was through an aggressive and innovative program of cost cutting. And they cut the cost to the point that they pushed it over the edge, and the collapse, right, cost them tons of money, $1 billion and a dozen lives, roughly. Here's a case of the emergency medical system in Israel, right? And one of the papers, if you go to the original resilience engineering book from our colleague Richard Cook, who went off and studied with a head of emergency services in Israel, happened to be there during a bus bombing and figured out all of the interesting ways the medical system had adapted in order to be effective in responding to casualties from mass casualty events. And so showing how they were able to generate and mobilize in ways that didn't fit the way the top-down compliance-based American system would work. Much more decentralized, much more initiative pushed down to lower levels, to other units closer to the point of action in the world. And we'll talk much more about that. But these are examples. And as you work through the class, you can keep thinking about collecting examples that are the image of brittleness or resilience. Brittleness, resilience. Because those examples will help you to communicate to other people. Next one. All right. Next, you're not in your groups. Next class, next thing to discuss. All right. How are we doing on time? We got an hour left? All right. Here's case number 1 to illustrate resilience in action. Shortly before surgery, the resident calls up the attending physician. So you know who a resident is? So they're the junior doctor in training in the specialty, and the attending is the senior doctor who's qualified already or certified, board certified. So the resident calls up the attending anesthesiologist and says, tomorrow's surgery is going to be short with little blood loss. All right, but the attending tells the resident, go in early and get extra lines. Extra lines for access into the patient's cardiovascular system to put in fluids or medications. What do you mean? The surgery is supposed to be short with little blood loss, right? However, the attending recognizes that it will be difficult to establish access quickly for this person in their context. An example might be someone who's recovering from burns. So peripheral vascular access is difficult to establish if someone's suffered burns. So if I need vascular access, I can't get it quick, and I might not get it reliably. So in case I need it, I better establish it when I don't have time pressure, right? There's other conditions that might lead to this. Furthermore, they recognize while the surgical plan is a typical surgical course, in this context, the procedure could go on much longer, and blood loss could be much greater than expected. So the standard is short and little fluid loss. However, they recognize there are a variety of factors in this case. Might be related to the surgeon, might be related to the patient, might be related to a lot of things. It says, wait a minute, right? It might go off plan. Doesn't mean it will mostly go off plan from a frequency point of view. Doesn't mean the probability of going off plan is high. The issue is the plan could go off. There's indicators that say it could go off plan. And if it goes off plan, there's a bottleneck. I need access. I need to put in fluid or medication quickly. So I will establish access in advance of the surgery in case I need it. All right, as a result, the attending instructs the resident to place more lines than normal when the patient's being prepped for surgery to allow the attending to respond quickly with fluid replacement or medications should challenges to cardiovascular physiology occur. Right? So here's a story. This is a classic story. Richard Cook and I found this in a study of expertise in anesthesia, God help us, 25 years ago. Sorry, getting old here. I can tell you stories. I was there for the stories. Too often now. So this was a classic story we heard. So this illustrates a fundamental of what does it mean to be resilient, stories of resilience, yeah?
How is this different than robustness? Because it seems like this is well modeled by the anesthesiologist, and they are setting up their system to be able to handle this situation.
Well, the issue is they don't know exactly what's going to happen, right? So this is where they know, this is why I like to use the phrase, they know the shape of surprise to come, right? It might be this surgeon always underestimates the length of the surgery, right? And so outsiders know when he says it's an hour long, it'll be an hour and a half. It might be because of the patient's condition, the longer the surgery, the greater the chances of needing to do some fluid replacement. So you're right, this is highlighting that we can know something about surprise, even though we don't know the details of the specific surprise. So it's not, I need to prepare because they're going to need blood pressure medicine that increases blood pressure because blood pressure will collapse, right? It's, I don't know what I'm going to need to give to handle the crisis. I just know there could be a crisis, and when I have the crisis, I need to act quickly, and if I have to first establish the mechanism to act, right, what does that make me? Slower? So I might do the right thing, but if I do it too slow, right, it might not be the right thing anymore. So, so I can be slow and stale. Right? And this is going to be the first and fundamental ways that adaptive systems break down. And it has a name called decompensation. Right? And we'll run through that once we do a little bit more about how basic feedback control mechanisms work. But that's what we're setting you up for. And the key thing we're illustrating here is that resilient performance has the ability to anticipate bottlenecks ahead. Anticipate bottlenecks ahead. And now we're going to contrast that with a second case. So again, this is a classic thing we saw over and over again, because our study of expertise said what's most important in anesthesiologist expertise, anticipating bottlenecks ahead. Right? Next one. So now let's take another case that really happened. That is, as anesthesiology became safer and safer, and there were other changes in medical practice, think of faster, better, cheaper, as well as new capabilities, what did we start changing? We started changing to have more surgeries occur in outpatient settings, like cosmetic surgery and many other forms. So all of you know this now, because in your families, and as people need surgery, they are often having them outpatient, not staying over in the hospital, not arriving the night before, a variety of kinds of things. So everybody's happier. It's faster, better, cheaper, right? The hospital gets faster turnaround. The patients mostly like this, whatever. The downside is, wait a minute, how do you plan for and deal with crises? Right? So you only do this if the expectation of crises are low, so you're getting better. On the other hand, if the crisis does occur, how do you respond to it effectively? Right? So anesthetic practice has migrated away from the traditional settings where there are a variety of technological and human resources that can be called on should a crisis occur. Now, we have an innovation in the late 90s, which is a safety manager in healthcare. There's the patient safety movement. So that was one thing I was involved in the startup of in 95, 96. And so now we start having these organizations have a safety manager, just like aviation companies have a safety manager. And the safety manager for the network recognizes that this change in how we do surgeries changes the risk profile, right? So as we move to more outpatient settings, it increased brittleness in the sense that should an unexpected crisis event trigger a crisis, there's less expertise, experience, and equipment available to manage the situation. Right? So everything is better, far from the boundary, but the boundary, in the sense of event that triggers a crisis, we could have a sudden collapse of the team's performance. Why? Because they're not used to practicing crises. Why? Because they never have crises. So if they have a crisis, they're not going to be prepared to deal with it very well. Right? So the safety manager initiates a new crisis management training program because there's new simulation resources available. We can now simulate operating room settings, and we can simulate with computerized patient dummies physiological crises. And so we can practice both teams as well as the crisis. Because guess what? Turns out physicians aren't naturally inborn with the ability to handle crises. Who would have known, right? That they just weren't that endowed with that from birth. Turns out, right, if you want to be good at crisis management, what should you do? Practice crisis management. How did they practice crisis management before? Crises were frequent enough that you got practice. Does that make you uncomfortable? Yes, you would rather have them practice it in a simulator. Wouldn't that be great, right? So here we have this capability coming along. All right. So now the question is, and this is going to be, I think what we're going to do is speed up here, and you're going to do this on CritViz instead of having a discussion now. So you're going to do it yourself. Contrast the two cases. Okay? I want you to contrast the position of the anesthesiologist and the safety manager. Right? And the reason is, I want you to think about the safety manager and what happens when no crises occur in outpatient surgery. What happens? Haven't had a history of crises, haven't had a botched crisis, and what's the hospital under? Financial pressure. Mm-hmm. So what an effective manager beyond the safety department is going to come in and say, wait a minute, I can't afford to have a surgical team go practice a crisis. They need to be doing surgeries. We need to increase turnover and utilize our capital resource of these surgeries. We need to turn over money, right, to pay all the expenses of this stuff. We need to increase productivity. You're safe. We haven't had a failure, right? We haven't had a crisis that was badly handled. Why do we need the training program? Think of how we could save resources and increase productivity if we cut this out. So how do you help the manager? How do you understand the difference between the two positions? And how do you help the safety manager justify sustaining the investment in the crisis management training? Right? Because the trade-off under faster, better, cheaper pressure is, why do I need crisis management training? How do you sustain the investment in the crisis management training? How do you justify that? And to do that, I want you to contrast the position the safety manager is in the network and the influences and pressures back and forth over time, versus the attending anesthesiologist and his position or her position, and why they can go and say to the resident, go in early and put in extra lines. What's the difference between those two? And what does that mean for the ability to sustain an investment in a source of resilience? How do you sustain an investment in a source of resilience? So that assignment is on CritViz. Right? What's the title again?
Open your eyes, how we make people go to sleep.
All right? That's the contest here. In the interest of time, I was going to have you discuss this, but I want to keep going because we've got to get to the dragons of surprise today. I can't get through today without dragons, right? Because otherwise this class is too boring. All right, keep going. I think, here's some definitions. So as you analyze high-frequency trading, as you think about the anesthesia cases, what I want you to think about is units of adaptive behavior, UABs. UABs, or an adaptive unit. So I don't want you to think of people. I don't want you to think of teams. I don't want you to think of automation. I don't want you to think of organizations. Right? I want you to think of adaptive units, units of adaptive behavior. Because we're going to lay out what are the properties of units of adaptive behavior. That's going to be a bunch of the definitions, right, that we're hitting, and we're going to say what those concepts are, where they come from in the history of, for example, biology and other places. Units of adaptive behavior exist in a network, right? And there's relationships and effects back and forth between those units. So when you think about the two anesthesiologists, the safety manager and the anesthesiologist, the attending, you think about where their position in the network is. What resources do they control? What other stakeholders influence them, put pressures on, change the resources they have available, right? So UABs adapt their activities, resources, tactics, and strategies in the face of variability and uncertainty, and they're trying to regulate what they do in order to achieve targets and manage various kinds of constraints. Right? For human systems, adaptation means adjusting behavior and changing priorities in the pursuit of goals. How do you change priorities? That's because goals conflict. So you have to decide, what am I going to do? Faster, better, cheaper, efficiency, or thoroughness? Am I going to pause production and pursue thoroughness and evaluate signs of risk? Am I going to delay the schedule of space shuttle launches because we have new debris strikes, new energy levels? Right? So do you adapt or don't you adapt? We're going to talk about this more as a potential to adapt. We use the phrase poised to adapt. You're poised to adapt. Can you adapt? Right? So that's a potential for change in the future. It's not that you have to do something, right? It's that you could do something if you saw the signs that things were different than expected. Poised to adapt. The first anesthesiologist is poised to adapt to a crisis, prepared for the crisis in advance so they can keep pace with the tempo of the crisis. So they can keep pace with the tempo of the crisis. Now, these UABs exist at nested multiple scales. So we can think about them as society's roles agents, and we'll play around with that. But they are nested and composable. So you are simultaneously part of different UABs, right? You're not just in one place, right? You can be thought of as part of a unit at different levels, depending on things. All right, and these units are active, seeking to improve how well they fit their environment, given what's going on in the world and what's going on in the interdependent units around them. Fit. Right? The word fitness is on your glossary list. And fitness is a difficult word in the history of evolutionary thinking and biology, but it's how do you build fitness? Fitness is not how fit your physiology is to exercise. Fitness is how well you are matched to your environment. And we'll talk more and explain more about fitness, which is one of these contestable concepts. It's one of these things that you're constantly trying to figure out what it really means. What does it mean to achieve fitness? And it's going to change us from we hit a goal and we're done to we're driving and navigating a complex world. And we have to have the skill to be able to continue to drive and navigate that world. That's a continuing, ongoing capability rather than a one and done. Right? We had a problem, we figured out a fix, we implemented the fix took care of the problem, we're done, wrap it in a ribbon, go home and rest. Not in the adaptive universe. Next one. If you look on your list, you'll see a thing's adaptive capacity, right? Modifying the potential for modifying what worked in the past to meet challenges in the future. That capacity is a relationship between the demands the world imposes on you and your ability to respond as a unit to those demands. Right? So how is the anesthesiologist responding to demands? So as you work through these cases, look at your glossary and start to see how some of the concepts that are laid out play out in those two cases. Right? How they're slightly different in those two cases because they're at different echelons. Therefore, they have different influences from different parts of the network. Range of adaptive behavior. Adaptive capacity has a range over what's capable of responding to changing demands, disturbances, and variations. Range of adaptive behavior. So you should see in all these things there is a range or boundary. The story of Columbia has a range of capability. Energy, debris events are outside the range that they had planned for and designed the system to be safe in the face of. So there's always a range. Where does this come from? Finite resources. If you have finite resources, no matter what you invest in, what you create, whether that's a human team, a design team, an analysis team, whether that's automation, even if it's more autonomous with the latest, greatest super AI, whatever, machine learning, whatever you throw in, it's an emergency department that's staffed to handle different kinds of crises that occurred in incoming patients. No matter what it is, it has a range over which it can work. And outside that range, it doesn't work very well. And that's a direct and logical consequence of finite resources. What that means is you can saturate. Saturate means you run out of capacity. You exhaust your capacity to continue to respond as demands increase or cascade. So you have to understand saturation. Saturation is a standard term in control engineering. Risk of saturation. In fact, if you want to understand control engineering, you understand how lag and risk of saturation kill control systems. Right? If you want to build a good system, it has to be capable of dealing with saturation and lags. Fold lags in with saturation because it's just a temporal saturation. In other words, you can't keep pace. You can't match the tempo of change in the world. So saturation, you exhaust a unit's range of adaptive behavior or capacity for maneuver as that unit responds to changing and increasing demands. So the risk of saturation, we can define then as the inverse of the remaining range or capacity given current demands and what we project as upcoming demands. And we will start looking at how saturation and risk of saturation actually drives adaptation. And that we can see in many, many cases, ICUs, emergency rooms, all kinds of settings. This is going to end up being a key concept for us understanding how the rules of the adaptive universe. And brittleness, we hit that one already, the descriptive version of this, a rapid fall off or collapse of performance when situations challenge boundaries. We've started to indicate what graceful extensibility is. It's the inverse of brittleness. We'll talk more about it. We've introduced tangled layered network. We reminded you we've got to think about what's fitness. And we're going to get to an adaptive landscape, because that's going to tell us about, that's also called a fitness landscape. We're going to understand how this stuff works.